Sometimes the most shocking moments in military history don't happen on battlefields, but in the places where honor and discipline should reign supreme. What happens when power corrupts so completely that it turns protectors into predators? This is the true story of how one general's unexpected arrival changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Riverside, a military training facility nestled in the hills of North Carolina. Colonel Sarah Martinez had been stationed there for 3 years, serving as one of the few female officers in a predominantly male environment. At 32, she had earned her position through relentless dedication, countless hours of study, and an unwavering commitment to serving her country. Her colleagues respected her tactical mind and her ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that had earned her recognition from higher command. But respect, Sarah had learned, was a fragile thing in the military. It could be built over years and destroyed in minutes. She was about to discover just how fragile it really was. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning during routine combat training exercises. Sarah was leading a group of 14 soldiers through advanced defensive maneuvers when Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson approached her, with what appeared to be legitimate concerns about the training protocol. Thompson was a veteran with 12 years of service, known for his by-the-book approach and stern demeanor. His weathered face bore the marks of multiple deployments, and his authority among the enlisted men was unquestionable. "Colonel Martinez," Thompson said, his voice carrying a tone that seemed respectful on the surface but harbored something darker beneath. "Some of the men are questioning whether these defensive positions you're teaching are actually effective in real combat situations." Sarah paused, studying Thompson's face. She had dealt with subtle challenges to her authority before, usually from soldiers who struggled to accept female leadership. "What specific concerns do they have, Sergeant?" she asked, maintaining her professional composure. Thompson glanced back at the group of soldiers who had gathered nearby, their eyes fixed on the exchange. "Well, ma'am, they're wondering if someone who hasn't seen actual combat should be teaching them how to fight." The comment hit like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed never been deployed to active combat zones, a fact that had always been a source of personal disappointment for her. She had requested deployment multiple times, only to be assigned to training and administrative roles. It was a sore spot that Thompson had just pressed deliberately. "My training credentials and tactical education are a matter of record, Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "These exercises are based on proven military doctrine and real-world applications." Thompson's lips curled into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, ma'am. We're just concerned about learning from someone with practical experience." The group of soldiers behind Thompson had grown larger, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her. Some looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. She recognized the dangerous dynamic forming, a public challenge to her authority that could either be handled decisively or spiral out of control. "Sergeant Thompson, I think we should discuss this privately," Sarah said, gesturing toward the administrative building. "Actually, ma'am, I think the men deserve to hear this conversation. After all, it's their training we're talking about." Sarah felt the situation slipping away from her. Thompson was deliberately escalating the confrontation in front of the enlisted soldiers, creating a spectacle that would undermine her authority regardless of how she responded. If she backed down, she would appear weak. If she pushed back too hard, she might be seen as unable to handle criticism. "Very well," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Let's address these concerns right now." What happened next would be talked about in hushed whispers throughout the base for months to come. Thompson stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "The truth is, Colonel," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "some of us don't think women belong in combat positions. Maybe you'd be better suited to administrative work where you can't get real soldiers killed." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's enough, Sergeant," she said firmly. "Report to my office immediately for disciplinary action." Thompson actually laughed, in front of the assembled soldiers. "Or what, Colonel? You'll write me up? Maybe send me to sensitivity training?" The situation had crossed a line from insubordination to something more dangerous. Sarah could sense the mood of the crowd shifting, becoming more aggressive and emboldened by Thompson's defiance. She had seen this dynamic before in her psychology studies. How group mentality could transform ordinary people into something worse. "I'm ordering you to stand down, Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice carrying the full weight of her rank. "You know what I think?" Thompson said, turning to address the soldiers behind him. I think the colonel needs to learn what real military discipline looks like. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Thompson grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. She tried to pull away, but two other soldiers stepped forward to block her path. The circle of men around them had grown tighter, and she realized with growing horror that this wasn't just insubordination, it was something much worse. "Let go of me," Sarah commanded, her training kicking in as she prepared to defend herself. "Hold her," Thompson ordered, and suddenly hands were grabbing her from multiple directions. Sarah fought back with every technique she had learned in hand-to-hand combat training, but she was outnumbered 14-1. Her military training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not this one, not being attacked by her own soldiers in the middle of a US military base. The assault began as what Thompson called teaching her a lesson about respect. But as more soldiers joined in, egged on by the group mentality and Thompson's encouragement, it escalated beyond anything any of them had probably intended when it started. Sarah's uniform was torn, her face bloodied, and her spirit nearly broken when she heard the sound that would save her life and change everything. The distinctive rumble of a military vehicle approaching at high speed. Through swollen eyes, she saw a black SUV racing across the training field, kicking up a cloud of dust behind it. The vehicle skidded to a stop just yards away from the group, and out stepped a figure that made every soldier freeze in place. General Robert Hayes was a legend in the U.S. Army. At 58, he had served in 3 wars, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and commanded respect from soldiers and officers alike. His presence was commanding, his reputation unassailable, and his tolerance for misconduct absolutely zero. The general's eyes swept across the scene, taking in Sarah's condition, the scattered soldiers, and Thompson's guilt-ridden face in a matter of seconds. His expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted immediately. The soldiers who had been emboldened moments before now looked like scared children caught in a terrible act. "What exactly is happening here?" General Hayes asked, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made grown men tremble. Thompson, still breathing heavily from the assault, tried to compose himself. "General Hayes, sir, there was a disciplinary issue." "A disciplinary issue?" The general stepped closer to Sarah, who was struggling to stand upright. Her uniform was torn, blood was running from her nose, and bruises were already forming on her arms and face. General Hayes had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had witnessed the aftermath of terrorist attacks and the horrors of war. But the sight of a female officer, one of his officers, beaten and brutalized by her own soldiers, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Somebody better start explaining what happened here, and they better do it right now," the general said, his voice rising for the first time. Sarah, despite her injuries, straightened as much as she could. Her voice was hoarse, but she spoke clearly. "General Hayes, I was conducting routine training exercises when Sergeant Thompson and these soldiers assaulted me." Thompson's face went white.
"That's not, sir. There was insubordination."
She wasn't following proper protocol. General Hayes looked at Thompson with the kind of stare that had intimidated enemy combatants in 2 different countries. "Sergeant, are you telling me that Colonel Martinez's failure to follow protocol justified 14 soldiers assaulting a superior officer?" The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the soldiers were now backing away, as if distance might somehow separate them from what had happened. Others stood frozen, realizing for the first time the magnitude of what they had done. "Sir, we were just trying to maintain discipline," one of the younger soldiers said, his voice barely audible. General Hayes turned his attention to the young man, a private first class who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "What's your name, soldier?" "Private Jensen, sir." "Private Jensen, in your military training, were you ever taught that assaulting a superior officer was an acceptable form of maintaining discipline?" "Were you ever taught that participating in a group assault on a female officer was appropriate behavior for a United States soldier?" "No, sir." The general's voice remained calm, but everyone present could feel the storm building beneath his controlled exterior. He had spent 35 years in the military, working his way up from enlisted man to general officer. He had dedicated his life to the principles of honor, courage, and commitment that the Army claimed to represent. What he was witnessing was a betrayal of everything he had spent his career defending. Sarah watched as the general surveyed the scene one more time. She could see him taking mental notes, cataloging evidence, preparing for what she knew would be swift and decisive action. General Hayes was known throughout the military for his fairness, but also for his absolute intolerance of misconduct, especially when it involved violence against fellow service members. "Colonel Martinez," the general said, turning back to Sarah. "Do you require medical attention?" "Private Jensen," the general commanded, Escort Colonel Martinez to the medical facility immediately. As Jensen moved to help Sarah, Thompson made what would prove to be his biggest mistake of the day. Sir, with respect, I think there's more to this situation than... Sergeant Thompson. General Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. You will remain silent until I address you directly. Is that understood? The general pulled out his phone and made a series of calls that would set in motion events none of the soldiers present could have imagined. Military police were dispatched to the scene. The base commander was notified. An investigation team was assembled. Within hours, what had started as a disciplinary issue during routine training had become a case that would reach the highest levels of military command. As Sarah was helped toward the medical facility, she heard General Hayes address the remaining soldiers. His words were measured, professional, and terrifying in their implications. Gentlemen, you have just participated in the assault of a fellow officer. This incident will be investigated fully. Charges will be filed, and each of you will be held accountable for your actions. Your military careers are over. The weight of those words, your military careers are over, hit the soldiers like a physical blow. Some had served for years, building their lives around military service. Others were young men who had seen the army as their path to adulthood and respectability. All of them had just thrown it away in a moment of mob mentality and poor judgment. Thompson, who had started the confrontation, now found himself facing the ruins of a 12-year career. The general's words echoed in his mind, as he realized that his prejudice and his need to publicly humiliate a female officer had not only destroyed his own future, but had dragged 14 other soldiers down with him. The first chapter of this story was ending, but the consequences were just beginning. General Hayes had witnessed something that violated every principle he held dear as a soldier and as a human being. He had seen his own soldiers turn into a mob, attacking one of their officers based on nothing more than gender bias and unchecked aggression. As the sun began to set over Camp Riverside, the general stood alone on the training field where the assault had taken place. The scene was quiet now, but the implications of what had happened here would ripple through the military justice system for months to come. 14 careers were about to end. A base's reputation was about to be destroyed. And one general was about to prove that in his army, honor and justice still meant something. The investigation that would follow would uncover not just the details of this one incident, but a pattern of behavior and culture that had allowed such an assault to happen. It would reveal systemic problems with leadership, training, and accountability that went far beyond one training exercise gone wrong. But all of that was yet to come. For now, General Hayes simply stood in the gathering darkness, contemplating how to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again under his watch. The soldiers who had participated in the assault were about to learn that actions have consequences and that some mistakes cannot be undone. Their military careers were indeed over, but the story of what happened that day was just beginning. General Hayes spent the night after the incident in his temporary quarters at Camp Riverside, but sleep eluded him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Colonel Martinez's bloodied face and the circle of soldiers who had participated in something that violated every principle he had spent 35 years defending. By dawn, he had made several decisions that would change not just the lives of the 14 soldiers involved, but the culture of the entire base. His first call was to Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison, his superior at Fort Bragg. Morrison had been expecting his call. Word of the incident had already reached her through military police reports and medical documentation of Colonel Martinez's injuries. Robert, Morrison's voice came through clearly despite the early hour. I've read the preliminary reports. Tell me this isn't as bad as it sounds. General Hayes stared out the window of his quarters, watching the sun rise over the base where he had hoped to complete his final assignment before retirement. It's worse, Patricia. Much worse. I witnessed 14 soldiers, led by a staff sergeant with 12 years of service, physically assault a female colonel during what was supposed to be routine training. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds.
When Morrison spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications immediately.
Do we have witnesses beyond yourself? I am the primary witness to the assault itself, but there were other personnel in the area who saw the aftermath.
Colonel Martinez has documented injuries. The scene was photographed by military police.
This isn't a case of conflicting stories or unclear evidence. What's your recommendation?
Hayes had been preparing for this question all night.
Full court-martial proceedings for all 14 soldiers involved. Assault charges at minimum. Conspiracy charges where applicable. I want them prosecuted to the full extent of military law. Robert, you know the media attention this will generate. 14 soldiers court-martialed for assaulting a female officer? The Army's reputation will take a significant hit. The general's jaw tightened. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had allowed the culture of impunity to develop in the first place. Patricia, with respect, the Army's reputation should take a hit. This didn't happen in a vacuum. There's a culture problem here that goes beyond these 14 individuals. I know you're right. I just want to make sure we handle this properly. What's Colonel Martinez's condition? She's in the base medical facility. Concussion, broken nose, multiple contusions, and psychological trauma that's probably more significant than her physical injuries. She's a good officer, Patricia. She didn't deserve this. No one deserves this, Robert. I'm authorizing a full investigation. You'll have whatever resources you need. After ending the call with Morrison, General Hayes made his way to the medical facility where Colonel Martinez was being treated. He found her sitting up in bed, her face swollen and discolored, but her eyes alert and focused. Despite her injuries, she attempted to stand when he entered the room. At ease, Colonel, Hayes said gently. How are you feeling? Sarah settled back into the bed, wincing slightly from the movement. I've been better, sir, but I want you to know that I appreciate your intervention yesterday. If you hadn't arrived when you did, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Both of them understood how much worse the situation could have become. Colonel, I need to ask you some questions for the investigation. Are you up for that? Yes, sir. General Hayes pulled up a chair beside her bed. Over the next hour, he took detailed notes as Sarah recounted every aspect of the incident, from Thompson's initial challenge to her authority, through the escalation to physical violence. Her memory was remarkably clear, despite the trauma she had endured. Had you experienced problems with Sergeant Thompson before? Hayes asked. Nothing this severe, but yes. There had been several instances of subtle insubordination, questioning my orders in front of other soldiers, making comments about female officers, that sort of thing. I documented what I could, but much of it was the kind of behavior that's hard to prove definitively. This was exactly what General Hayes had suspected. The assault hadn't been an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to fester and grow. Why didn't you escalate these earlier incidents? Sarah hesitated before answering. Honestly, sir, I was concerned about being seen as unable to handle my own soldiers. There's already enough skepticism about female officers in combat roles. I thought I could manage the situation through normal leadership channels. The general nodded, understanding the impossible position she had been in. Female officers in the military often faced a double bind. If they complained about harassment or discrimination, they were seen as weak or unable to handle the job. If they remained silent, the behavior continued and often escalated. That ends now, Hayes said firmly. No officer in my command should have to tolerate this kind of behavior, and no officer should feel they have to handle it alone. After completing his interview with Colonel Martinez, General Hayes returned to the base headquarters where he found the 14 soldiers from the previous day's incident sitting in a conference room under military police guard. They had been detained overnight, and their faces showed the full weight of their situation had finally sunk in. Staff Sergeant Thompson sat at the head of the table, his earlier bravado completely gone. The other 13 soldiers ranged in age from 19 to 31, representing various ranks and levels of military experience. What they all had in common now was the realization that their military careers were over. General Hayes entered the room, and all 14 men immediately stood at attention. Their movements were sharp and precise, the muscle memory of military discipline that made their previous day's behavior even more inexcusable. Sit down, the general commanded. He studied their faces for a long moment before speaking. Some looked defiant, others appeared genuinely remorseful, and a few seemed to be in shock at how quickly their lives had changed. Gentlemen, you are all facing serious criminal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to legal representation, and you will each be assigned a military defense attorney if you cannot afford civilian counsel. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court-martial proceedings. Private Jensen, the youngest member of the group, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, permission to speak? Granted. Sir, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. When Sergeant Thompson started challenging Colonel Martinez, I thought it was just normal military discussion. I didn't realize that it would become that you would assault a superior officer. General Hayes finished. Yes, sir. No, sir. I'm sorry, sir. The general turned his attention to Thompson. Sergeant, you initiated this incident. You led these soldiers into committing acts that will destroy their careers and potentially land them in military prison. What do you have to say for yourself? Thompson met the general's eyes for only a moment before looking down at the table. I have no excuse, sir. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment.
Your personal feelings?
You mean your prejudice against female officers? Sir, Yes, sir. I suppose that's what it was. General Hayes had heard enough. He stood up, his presence filling the room and commanding the absolute attention of every soldier present. Let me explain something to all of you, he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. The United States Army is built on 3 core values: honor, courage, and commitment. Yesterday, every single one of you violated all 3 of these values.
He began pacing in front of the table, his words deliberate and measured.
You violated honor by attacking a fellow soldier who had done nothing but attempt to do her job. You violated courage by participating in a group assault on a single individual. And you violated commitment by betraying the oath you took to serve your country and support your fellow service members. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of the general's boots on the floor. But your violation of military values is not the worst part of what you did. The worst part is that you revealed yourselves to be the kind of men who will attack a woman simply because she holds authority over you. You revealed yourselves to be cowards and bullies. Several of the soldiers were now visibly emotional, some with tears in their eyes. The full weight of their actions and the general's condemnation was hitting them like a physical blow. Sergeant Thompson, Hayes continued, you have 12 years of military service. In that time, you have deployed to combat zones, earned commendations, and presumably served with honor. How does it feel to know that all of that will be overshadowed by your decision to lead a mob assault on a female officer? Thompson's voice was barely audible when he replied, It feels terrible, sir. I don't know what came over me. What came over you was the same thing that has come over men throughout history who cannot accept that women are their equals. You allowed your prejudice to turn you into something the army cannot and will not tolerate. The general stopped pacing and faced the group directly. Here's what's going to happen. Each of you will face individual court-martial proceedings. The charges will include assault on a superior officer, conspiracy, conduct unbecoming a soldier, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If convicted, you will face imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, and the permanent destruction of your military records. The implications of these charges were staggering. A dishonorable discharge would follow them for the rest of their lives, affecting their ability to find employment, qualify for veterans' benefits, or even rent apartments in some cases. Military prison time would create criminal records that would haunt them permanently. But the legal consequences are just the beginning, Hayes continued. What you did yesterday will be investigated thoroughly. Every aspect of the culture that allowed this to happen will be examined. Other soldiers who may have witnessed harassment or discrimination and remained silent will be questioned. This base's leadership structure will be scrutinized from top to bottom. Private Jensen raised his hand again. Sir, what about the other soldiers who saw what happened but didn't participate? That's an excellent question, Private. Any soldier who witnessed the beginning of this incident and failed to intervene will also face consequences. In the United States Army, we have a duty to protect our fellow soldiers regardless of gender or rank. Standing by and watching while a fellow service member is assaulted is also a violation of military law and military values. The investigation that followed over the next several weeks was unlike anything Camp Riverside had ever seen. Military investigators interviewed hundreds of personnel, reviewed months of incident reports, and examined the base's training records and leadership structure. What they found was a systematic pattern of behavior that had created the conditions for the assault to occur. Colonel Martinez's early reports of Thompson's insubordination were just the tip of the iceberg. Other female personnel at the base had experienced similar treatment, but had been even more reluctant to report it. The base's leadership had either ignored these issues or handled them with such light disciplinary action that they had essentially encouraged their continuation. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, another female officer at the base, came forward during the investigation to report her own experiences with Thompson and several of the other soldiers involved in the assault. Sergeant Thompson made comments about my qualifications almost daily, she told investigators. He would question my orders in front of enlisted personnel, make jokes about women in combat roles, and generally try to undermine my authority. When I reported it to my commanding officer, I was told that Thompson was just old school and that I needed to develop thicker skin. This pattern repeated throughout the investigation. Female personnel had been subjected to a hostile work environment that had been not only tolerated but enabled by leadership that viewed it as normal military culture. General Hayes found himself facing a situation that was far more complex than a single incident of assault. He was dealing with a systemic failure of leadership and military culture that had allowed discrimination and harassment to flourish unchecked. The media attention that Lieutenant General Morrison had predicted materialized quickly and intensely. National news outlets picked up the story of 14 soldiers facing court-martial for assaulting a female officer. Women's rights organizations held protests demanding justice. Veterans groups expressed shame and anger at the betrayal of military values. But, perhaps most significantly, other female service members across the country began coming forward with their own stories of harassment, discrimination, and assault within the military. The incident at Camp Riverside had become a catalyst for a broader examination of how women were treated throughout the armed forces. General Hayes held a base-wide assembly 3 weeks after the incident. Nearly 3,000 soldiers filled the main auditorium as he took the stage to address what had happened and what would happen next. 3 weeks ago, 14 soldiers at this base committed acts that violated everything the United States Army stands for, he began. They assaulted a fellow officer, they betrayed their oath of service, and they brought shame on every soldier who has ever worn this uniform. The auditorium was completely silent as he continued. But those 14 soldiers did not act in isolation. They acted within a culture that had allowed harassment and discrimination to become normalized. They acted with the implicit support of leaders who had failed to address these problems when they were smaller and more manageable. Hayes paused, letting his words sink in. That culture ends today. From this moment forward, any act of harassment, discrimination, or violence against a fellow service member will be met with immediate and severe consequences. Any leader who fails to address these issues will be relieved of command. Any soldier who witnesses misconduct and fails to report it will be held accountable. The general's voice grew stronger as he outlined the changes that would be implemented immediately. We will be implementing new training programs focused on respect, equality, and military values. We will be establishing anonymous reporting systems for harassment and discrimination. We will be bringing in external investigators to review every complaint that has been filed at this base over the past 5 years. He looked out over the sea of faces before him, knowing that some were supportive of these changes while others resented them. Some of you may think these measures are excessive. Some of you may believe that what happened to Colonel Martinez was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect broader problems. To those soldiers, I say this: you are wrong, and you are part of the problem. The bluntness of his statement sent a ripple through the audience. The United States Army is not a boys' club. It is not a place where women must prove themselves worthy of basic respect and dignity. It is a professional military organization that depends on every soldier being able to trust and depend on every other soldier, regardless of gender, race, or background. As General Hayes concluded his remarks, he knew that the hardest work was yet to come. Changing a culture that had been entrenched for decades would not happen overnight. There would be resistance, setbacks, and challenges that he couldn't even anticipate yet. But the 14 soldiers who had thought they could assault Colonel Martinez with impunity were about to learn that some lines cannot be crossed. Their court-martial proceedings were scheduled to begin within the month, and General Hayes was determined to ensure that justice would be served not just for Colonel Martinez, but for every service member who had ever been victimized by the culture of discrimination and harassment that had allowed this assault to happen. The story was far from over, but the message was clear. In General Hayes's army, honor meant something, and those who violated it would pay the price. The court-martial proceedings began on a cold Monday morning in March, 6 weeks after the assault on Colonel Martinez. The military courthouse at Fort Bragg had been selected as the venue, both for its larger facilities and to ensure that media attention didn't disrupt operations at Camp Riverside. General Hayes sat in the gallery, having been called as the primary witness for the prosecution. The 14 soldiers faced a panel of 7 military officers who would serve as judge and jury in their cases. Due to the complexity and number of defendants, the proceedings were divided into separate trials, with Staff Sergeant Thompson being tried first as the ringleader of the assault. Colonel James Patterson, the military prosecutor, was a veteran of numerous high-profile court-martial cases. His opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with devastating precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the panel," Patterson began, "what you will hear over the next several days is not a story about a training exercise gone wrong. It is not a story about military discipline or conflicting orders. It is a story about a group of soldiers who decided that their female commanding officer needed to be taught a lesson, and who used violence and intimidation to try to teach it." Thompson's defense attorney, Captain Maria Santos, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against her client was overwhelming, and General Hayes's eyewitness testimony was unassailable. Her strategy focused on arguing for mitigation rather than innocence. Staff Sergeant Thompson made terrible decisions that day, Santos acknowledged in her opening statement. He allowed his personal feelings and outdated attitudes to cloud his judgment. But he is not the monster the prosecution wants to portray. He is a soldier who served his country for 12 years, who deployed multiple times to combat zones, who earned commendations for bravery and service. When Colonel Martinez took the stand to testify about the assault, the courtroom was completely silent. Her voice was steady and clear as she recounted the events, but the impact of her words was devastating. When Sergeant Thompson grabbed my arm, I initially thought it was just aggressive posturing, she testified. But when the other soldiers began to surround me, when I realized they intended to physically assault me, I felt a fear unlike anything I had experienced before. These were my own soldiers, men I had trained and led, and they were treating me like an enemy. Under cross-examination, Captain Santos attempted to suggest that Colonel Martinez had provoked the incident through poor leadership or inappropriate conduct. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Captain Santos, Colonel Martinez replied calmly, "Are you suggesting that anything I said or did justified 14 soldiers physically assaulting me? Are you suggesting that female officers should expect to be beaten if they fail to lead in exactly the manner their subordinates prefer?" When General Hayes took the stand, his testimony was brief but powerful. He described arriving at the scene, seeing Colonel Martinez's condition, and witnessing the aftermath of what he characterized as a mob assault on a fellow soldier. "In 35 years of military service," Hayes testified, "I have never seen anything more contrary to military values and basic human decency than what I witnessed that day. These soldiers violated their oath, betrayed their service, and committed acts that have no place in any civilized organization, let alone the United States Army." Under cross-examination, Captain Santos attempted to suggest that General Hayes was being influenced by political correctness or pressure to support female integration in the military. "Captain Santos," the general replied, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "I don't care if Colonel Martinez was male or female, black or white, young or old. What I saw was soldiers assaulting a superior officer. That is unacceptable under any circumstances." The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from other personnel at Camp Riverside, who described the pattern of harassment and discrimination that had preceded the assault. Captain Rodriguez testified about her own experiences with Thompson and several of the co-defendants. Other soldiers described witnessing inappropriate comments and behavior that had created a hostile environment for female personnel. Perhaps most damaging was testimony from Private First Class David Kim, one of the soldiers who had been present during the assault but had not participated. Kim had initially remained silent about what he had witnessed, but the investigation had uncovered his presence at the scene. "I saw Sergeant Thompson grab Colonel Martinez," Kim testified. "I saw the other soldiers surround her. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I didn't do anything to stop it." "Why didn't you intervene?" Prosecutor Patterson asked. "I was afraid," Kim admitted. "I was afraid of what the other soldiers would do to me if I tried to help her. I was afraid of being labeled a traitor or a troublemaker." Kim's testimony illustrated one of the most troubling aspects of the incident, the culture of silence and complicity that had allowed the assault to occur. Even soldiers who knew the attack was wrong had been too intimidated to intervene. The defense strategy for most of the co-defendants focused on arguing that they had been following Thompson's lead and had gotten caught up in group mentality. Several of the younger soldiers testified that they had never intended to seriously harm Colonel Martinez and that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had planned. Private Jensen, the 19-year-old who had asked permission to speak during General Hayes' initial confrontation with the soldiers, was among the most remorseful of the defendants. "I never should have gotten involved," he testified during his own trial. "When I saw Sergeant Thompson challenging Colonel Martinez, I should have walked away. When I saw him grab her, I should have stopped him. Instead, I let myself get caught up in what everyone else was doing." Jensen's attorney argued that his client was a young man who had made a terrible mistake but deserved a second chance. The prosecution countered that joining a mob assault on a female officer was not a youthful indiscretion, but a serious crime that demanded serious consequences. The trials continued for 3 months, with each defendant facing individual proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming in every case, and the verdicts were unanimous: guilty on all major charges. Thompson received the harshest sentence: 5 years in military prison, reduction to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dishonorable discharge. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years in prison, with similar reductions in rank and dishonorable discharges. But the legal proceedings were only part of the story. The broader investigation into the culture at Camp Riverside had uncovered systemic problems that reached far beyond the 14 soldiers who had participated in the assault. Base Commander Colonel Richard Blake was relieved of duty after the investigation revealed that he had received multiple complaints about harassment and discrimination, but had failed to take appropriate action. His replacement, Colonel Patricia Chen, was brought in specifically to implement the cultural changes that General Hayes had promised. The changes were comprehensive and immediate. New training programs were implemented that focused not just on preventing harassment and discrimination, but on creating a culture where all soldiers felt valued and respected. Anonymous reporting systems were established that allowed personnel to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Most significantly, a new policy was implemented that held leaders directly accountable for the behavior of their subordinates. Commanders who failed to address harassment or discrimination in their units faced automatic relief from duty and potential disciplinary action. The impact extended far beyond Camp Riverside. The case became a catalyst for military-wide reforms in how harassment and assault cases were handled. Congress held hearings on military culture and gender integration. The Department of Defense implemented new policies and training programs across all branches of the military. For Colonel Martinez, the aftermath of the assault was a complex mixture of vindication and ongoing struggle. While she had received justice through the legal system, the psychological impact of being attacked by her own soldiers remained significant. "People ask me if I feel vindicated by the court-martial results," she said in an interview 6 months after the assault. "The truth is, vindication doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't change the fact that 14 soldiers I'd trained and led decided I was their enemy simply because I was a woman with authority over them." However, Martinez also found purpose in using her experience to help other female service members. She became an advocate for military reform and worked with organizations focused on preventing sexual assault and harassment in the military. "If my experience can help prevent other women from going through what I went through, then maybe some good can come from something terrible," she said. General Hayes, meanwhile, spent his final months before retirement implementing the changes he had promised. The transformation of Camp Riverside became his personal mission, and he was determined to ensure that the culture that had enabled the assault would never return. "Cultural change is harder than winning battles," Hayes reflected as he prepared for retirement. "In battle, you can identify the enemy and defeat them. In cultural change, the enemy is often attitudes and assumptions that have been ingrained for generations." The general's efforts were aided by an unexpected source. Some of the soldiers who had witnessed the assault but had not participated, motivated by guilt over their inaction and inspired by Hayes's leadership, many of them became advocates for the cultural changes being implemented. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, who had been present during the assault but had not intervened, became one of the most vocal supporters of the new policies. "I failed as a soldier and as a human being when I stood by and watched Colonel Martinez being attacked," Torres said during a base-wide assembly on military values. "I tell myself that I was shocked, that I didn't know how to react, but the truth is I was a coward. We all were." The 14 soldiers who attacked her were criminals, but those of us who watched and did nothing were also guilty. Torres's admission was powerful because it acknowledged a truth that many were reluctant to face. The assault had been enabled not just by the 14 participants, but by a broader culture of complicity and silence. The long-term impact of the incident continued to unfold years after the court-martial proceedings had concluded. Several of the convicted soldiers attempted to rebuild their lives after serving their prison sentences, with mixed results. Private Jensen, the youngest of the group, served 2 years in military prison before being released with a dishonorable discharge. He struggled to find employment and housing as his criminal record and military discharge status made him undesirable to many employers and landlords. "I made a stupid decision when I was 19 years old, and I'll pay for it for the rest of my life," Jensen said in a rare interview 5 years after the incident. "I don't expect sympathy, and I don't think I deserve it. But I do hope that my story serves as a warning to other young soldiers about how quickly your life can be destroyed by following the wrong person's lead." Thompson, as the ringleader, faced the harshest consequences. After serving 5 years in military prison, he was released to find that his 12 years of military service counted for nothing in the civilian job market. His dishonorable discharge and criminal record made him virtually unemployable in any position requiring trust or authority. "I destroyed my own life and the lives of 13 other men because I couldn't accept that a woman was my superior officer," Thompson said during a mandatory counseling session while in prison. "I let my prejudice turn me into something I never thought I could become, a criminal who attacks women." The psychological impact on Thompson appeared to be significant. Prison counselors reported that he suffered from severe depression and anxiety, conditions that were likely exacerbated by his complete fall from respected NCO to convicted felon. For the Army as an institution, the incident became a case study in how quickly military culture could deteriorate when leadership failed to address problems early. The case was included in leadership training curricula across all branches of the military, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of failing to maintain proper standards of conduct. The broader implications extended beyond military culture to society as a whole. The case became a reference point in discussions about workplace harassment, gender equality, and the importance of bystander intervention in preventing assault and abuse. Women's rights organizations used the case to highlight the ongoing challenges faced by women in male-dominated professions. The fact that 14 soldiers had felt comfortable assaulting a female officer in broad daylight on a military base suggested that similar attitudes might exist in other institutions. Law enforcement agencies began incorporating lessons from the case into their own training programs, recognizing that the dynamics that had led to the assault group mentality, challenge to authority, enabling by bystanders, could occur in any organization where power imbalances existed. As General Hayes prepared for his retirement ceremony, he reflected on the incident that had defined his final year of military service. The transformation of Camp Riverside had been successful. Harassment complaints had dropped dramatically. Female personnel reported feeling safer and more respected, and the overall culture had shifted significantly. The assault on Colonel Martinez was a tragedy, but it also became a catalyst for necessary change. Hayes said in his retirement speech, "We learned that maintaining military values requires constant vigilance and the courage to confront problems, when they're small, before they grow into something monstrous." The general's words proved prophetic. In the years following his retirement, Camp Riverside became a model for military bases throughout the country. The policies and training programs implemented there were adopted widely, and the base's transformation was studied by military leaders seeking to prevent similar incidents at their own installations. Colonel Martinez eventually returned to active duty after recovering from her physical and psychological injuries. She was promoted to full colonel and later to brigadier general, becoming one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Army. Her experience as a victim of assault gave her a unique perspective on military leadership and reform. "What happened to me was terrible, but it also taught me something important about leadership," General Martinez said during her promotion ceremony. "Sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't against foreign enemies, but against the prejudice and hatred that can exist within our own ranks." The 14 soldiers who had participated in the assault were never again able to serve their country in uniform. Their dishonorable discharges were permanent, and their criminal records would follow them for the rest of their lives. Some found ways to contribute positively to society despite their past mistakes, while others continued to struggle with the consequences of their actions. The incident at Camp Riverside became a watershed moment in military history, a clear demonstration that assault and harassment would no longer be tolerated, regardless of the gender or rank of the victim. It proved that even in institutions known for their resistance to change, determined leadership could transform culture and enforce standards of basic human decency. General Hayes's intervention had saved more than just Colonel Martinez's life that day. It had saved the honor of an institution that depended on trust, respect, and mutual support among its members. The 14 soldiers who thought they could attack a female officer with impunity learned that actions have consequences, and that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Their careers were indeed over, but from the ashes of their disgrace, a better, more honorable military culture had begun to emerge. "Hit her!" 14 soldiers attacked, until the general witnessed it and ended their careers.